Good afternoon. My name is Henrik Urdal, and I'm the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. Very warm welcome to you all to this seminar on digital echoes, understanding patterns of mass violence with data and statistics, featuring Patrick Ball. Patrick is Director of Research at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, or HRDAG among friends. HRDAG is this year's winner of the prestigious Rafto Annual Human Rights Award, and Patrick and his crew were in Bergen this past Sunday to receive the award. And the Rafto Prize has been given to a number of great human rights defenders in the past, both organizations and individuals. But this is the first time that the prize is awarded to a research organization, acknowledging the importance of rigorous scientific work for documenting human rights abuses globally. And for PRIO, as an academic institution engaged in highly policy-relevant work, it is very appropriate and extremely worthwhile to be able to host this seminar. And I would like to also commend the Rafto Foundation for what I believe is both a very well-deserved and a very important prize. My own experience with HRDAG goes back to 1999 when I was an investigations assistant for Helge Brunborg at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where we, among other things, recorded and analyzed deaths following the fall of the Srebrenica enclave back in 1995. And HRDAG provided already then the gold standard. So I was a Patrick groupie at that time. And Patrick and HRDAG provided the, as I said, the gold standard for documenting and estimating mortality from armed conflict and from other contexts of human rights abuses, using meticulously collected and analyzed data to expose human rights abuses and to keep governments, groups and individuals accountable. And Patrick later gave testimony at the ICTY in the trial against Slobodan Milosevic on the atrocities committed by the Yugoslav army in Kosovo. HRDAG has worked on contexts as diverse as Guatemala, Philippines, Colombia, Syria, and also police brutality in the US. And Patrick will be taking us through some of that work today. He will be lecturing for about 45 minutes, and after that we will be having two commentators, Ragnhild Nordås, senior researcher at PRIO, and Marie Osnes, senior advisor at NORAD. And I would just like to inform you that we will be taping this session. So it's broadcasted live on Teams. And we also have a Teams audience here. It will be then put out after this session and forever be in the public domain. So just so you know, if you want to ask questions, you will be taped. It will also be possible then to ask questions both in the audience and online. This is an event hosted jointly with NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and I am now going to leave the floor to Håvard Mokleiv Nygaard, who is the Director of Knowledge at NORAD, to say a few words, and then he will be inviting Patrick to stage. Håvard, please.
Yes, thank you, Henrik. So actually just struck me that I think this is the first time I'm standing here not as a PRIO employee, and the first time I'm back at PRIO since leaving PRIO and starting at NORAD, so that feels a bit strange, but that's not going to be the focus here today. Anyway, as Henrik said, my name is Håvard Mokleiv Nygaard. I'm the Director of Knowledge. That always cracks Patrick up at NORAD. So let me start by congratulating HRDAG and Patrick on behalf of NORAD for this year's Rafto Prize for Human Rights. Let me also congratulate Rafto, represented by Ivar, with what I would call a truly inspiring Human Rights Prize award. I think this is perhaps the most interesting human rights award I have seen in a very, very long time. And we all know, of course, that Rafto tends to be a little bit ahead of the curve. So, Patrick, I hope you have your, make sure your tuxedo is fitted so that you're all set for the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or something. That's going to be my wager. Anyway, my experience with HRDAG started a little bit differently from Henrik. It goes back to when I was a PhD student, and my first experience was basically being quite intensely jealous of Anita Gödes, who was here at PRIO at the time, and who got to go to California once a year to work with HRDAG and the wonderful people over there. Of course, since then, I've grown to know and admire the organization. So we have this new slogan at NORAD these days, Fakta har makta. It is beautiful, I would say, in Norwegian. It does not work very well in English. Basically, it translates into something like facts rule, or the facts should rule, or something like that. Now, human rights are fundamental for everything NORAD does, for everything Norwegian Development Assistance does, and Norwegian Development Assistance is supposed to be rights-based. So just as much as we need facts about education, about vaccines, about deforestation, we desperately need facts about human rights. And I think we need that now more than ever. We know that a number of states have quite actively used the corona pandemic to tamp down on civil society, to repress opposition, and to curtail basic civil and political rights. And this comes in the middle of a prolonged decline, worldwide decline of democratization. So I think we need HRDAG now more than ever. We need you guys to make sense of the chaos, to tell us what are indeed facts and what is simply noise or linguistic big data, which aren't fact. We need basically HRDAG to make sure that we live up to the ideal of leaving no one behind. So with that, Patrick, please, the floor is yours.
Apologies for the delay.
All the facts that.
It's been a while since we've had an event live in person. And when you have a pandemic, people change the settings on your computer. There we are.
Perfect. Thank you.
Have to click.
All set. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I must say that's an introduction that will be difficult to live up to. Thank you so much. It is a tremendous, tremendous pleasure to be here at PRIO. I've been hearing about PRIO literally for decades. And two of my dearest colleagues have told me for a long time how warmly received they have been here, and even perhaps more importantly for scholars, how well challenged and stimulated they were working here. And of course, I refer to Anita and Christian Davenport, two of my longest term friends and colleagues. I've been doing this work for about 30 years. And I started in El Salvador in 1991, building databases for a human rights group there, where our task was to take narrative information from legal depositions and make it into database records. And the idea we had is, if we could transform this data into database records, we could do database things with it. We could, for example, link the data to the perpetrator records, the perpetrator's career histories, in order to change the data from being the reports of victims into dossiers on each officer's human rights human rights career, the things that the violence they'd committed. Since then, we've worked with 10 truth commissions. We've been expert witnesses in 6 trials, both at the international level, trials including 3 former heads of state, as well as 4 UN missions. We advise the High Commissioner for Human Rights in some questions, and we work with both international and national level NGOs. But for us, the most important projects are always those of the communities, the local groups at the communities most affected. Those for us are the beginning and the end of our work. And often, and very often, and I'll emphasize this throughout this talk, they're also the best sources of data. They're also the people who produce the most useful information for this kind of analysis. I put this slide up. I can't wait to get back to California and reorganize this slide and cover it with the logos of our new Norwegian partners. So I'm delighted to be here, and I want to use this to really thank the Rafto Foundation. This has been a truly life-changing experience for us.
Patrick, I've been asked to move you closer to the screen so that the online viewers can see.
Oh. Hi, online viewers. Hope this is helpful. Okay. What I want to say, though, is even though I'm going to be talking about data, the most important data is the data we don't have. And I'm going to give throughout this talk my concerns about what missing data does to our analysis, that biases in data collection can lead us to wrong and sometimes egregiously wrong conclusions, terribly wrong conclusions. Statisticians have known this for over a century, right? The big data versus sampling approach was fought out in the 20s and 30s. Big data did not win. And yet, here we are, often thinking that because we have a really big data set, somehow it's become magically representative of the underlying patterns. When we're collecting human rights data, we usually don't know what we don't know. And that means that we don't know if what we don't know is systematically different from what we do know, which may be a bit of a tangle as a statement. But if you think about what's missing, well, why should people who don't trust us talk to us? If we only talk to the people who did trust us and we tell their stories, in what sense is that statistically representative of the suffering of the much larger population? In fact, we can get the story terribly wrong. So I'm going to begin. I'll give a little bit of examples. In fact, one somewhat extended example from Guatemala. But as I said, I've testified against quite a few terrible, terrible war criminals. Some of their photos are here on the screen. I only testified against 2 of them, though, unfortunately. The other one did not face trial. Let's move on. Let's say that we have collected and organized 3 databases. Okay? So we've collected databases from various parts of society. We have, at great effort, deduplicated and linked those databases together, which is a terrifically fun machine learning hack. I hope there's in the Q&A, we can go into the details of how we do this. It's a lot of fun. And from that, we can articulate the space of the white circles intersecting here on the Venn diagram. But here's the problem. Are we living in the world on the left where we can observe something like a third of reality? Or are we living in the world on the right where we observe almost all of it? The problem is worse because, in fact, different strata, that is to say, different segments of the society probably are represented in wildly different ways. At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru in 2003, we looked at the data we could observe from killings committed by Sendero Luminoso and killings committed by the Peruvian army, and we discovered that the number of killings reported to the commission and all the prior projects was approximately equal between the 2 parties. Now, the data reported to the commission, though, suggested that there were many more violations committed by Sendero, but we had all these other sources that focused on the army. We couldn't tell the difference between whether the killings were equal, which is what the data said. We were stuck with that until we did the modeling. We had to figure out what was missing. And after we did the modeling, it became very, very clear that there were a whole lot more deaths committed by Sendero Luminoso than by the Peruvian army. Subsequent data collection in Peru has validated this conclusion. Okay? So it's really important to say we have lots of examples where we've done this kind of estimation and we subsequently get a validation of it. We can talk about Kosovo in particular if there are questions in the Q&A about validation issues for the method that I'll suggest for you today. Because we need to figure out from the data clues about bias. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about the Iraq body count, which is a really, really terrific and very, very important source about violence in Iraq. And I don't mean the analysis I do here to be critical of Iraq body count. I do explicitly mean to be critical of people who use Iraq body count as though it is a quantitative representation of reality. The Iraq body count is a fantastic index to the world's reporting on Iraq. It is a terrible quantitative source for information about statistical patterns. Those are very different things. So let me talk about why this worries me. After we had this debate with Iraq body count for some years, they were willing to share with us the full data from the Februarys of 4 years. And I combined the data from those months and organized it in terms of the size of the events reported. Okay, so on the far right, we have a bar that represents all the events of 15 or more victims, events with a lot of victims. These are all killings. The second bar to the left is 6 to 14 victims, then 2 to 5 victims, and on the far left, we have a bar representing events of only 1 victim. The bars are shaded by the number of reports. Now remember, Iraq body count is a compendium primarily of media reports with some additional reporting by the US Army Significant Acts Database and Iraqi government reporting. So there are hundreds of sources in the Iraq body count. And so when an event is very large, we find that there are very often a lot of sources. In fact, something like 80% of all events of 15 or more victims are reported by 15 or more sources. Okay, so big events, lots and lots and lots of reporting. But if you move to the far left of the graph and you say, how many reports do we get about events of size 1, individual executions, we find that 3/4 of them have only 1 or 2 sources. Okay, so let's return to what bias means to a statistician. Bias means the systematic distortion between our observation and what we believe to be true. So one of the ways that distortion occurs is through selection bias. Selection bias for me largely means what is not selected, what is not chosen to be in the sample. So in this context, what size of events do you think intuitively have 0 sources? That is to say, are not reported at all. And I hope it's clear to you intuitively that events of size 1 are much less likely to be reported than large events. This should make sense. And I think it should be intuitively clear why this is the case. This, of course, causes an enormous problem if we use this data to understand the world in a quantitative sense. Certainly, again, it is an excellent index to the source material, and it could be the basis of subsequent modeling. But as data, it is deeply, deeply biased. And this is a giant political problem because the large events and the small events were completely different conflicts happening simultaneously in Iraq. Large events, largely committed by al-Qaeda in Iraq or by coalition collateral damage incidents. The primary weapon in the large events were improvised explosive devices or airstrikes. The victims of these events were primarily a random selection of the Iraqi population. Old people, young people, men, women, Sunni, Shia, all kinds of different people. And the political goals were either destabilization or control, depending on which of the 2 big perpetrators it was. This is totally different than the small events. The small events were largely committed by Shia militias with firearms against adult men with the goal of ethnic cleansing. Of course, these are the events in which Shia militias drove Sunni people out of Baghdad and its suburbs and drove them into Western Iraq. Okay, look, let's take a moment and think about why this structure of bias occurred. First of all, when a large event occurs, it gets a lot of attention from the coalition forces. So they secure the area, and by securing the area, they make it possible for international and national journalists to cover it really well. Second, big events are more interesting in the world media. If it bleeds, it leads, is what has been taught to journalism students for decades. Third, al-Qaeda in Iraq was, at least in the cover story of the coalition, part of the reason that the coalition had invaded. The coalition did not invade to enable ethnic cleansing, right? So one of these stories was much more interesting to the coalition than the other. So all of these factors go into creating a news environment in which one of these kinds of events, one of these conflicts is very well represented and the other hardly represented at all. Look, it is not the job of the world's media to give us a random probability sample of events in the world. That's not their job, okay? But if we're going to think intelligently about the world and we're going to try to draw conclusions about what's going on, and we're going to use statistics as one of the mechanisms that we try to use to expand our knowledge, we need to get out of tautology. We need to stop asking the media to go document the thing that we're going to then be worried about, and then later do statistics on the documentation and discover that the thing we sent them to document, they in fact documented and conclude that's important. Okay? And that circularity is what affected, I think, a lot of thinking around Iraq between 2005 and 2010. I'm not saying that bad statistical analysis is the cause of the rise of the Islamic State, which is, of course, what happened when all of those Sunni people went to Western Iraq. That's not my claim here at all. What I am saying, though, is that if we turn to statistics as a mechanism for counteracting our presuppositions, we'd better make sure that we've designed the statistical study in a way that doesn't simply reproduce those presuppositions. Okay? So let me turn to another example. Police homicides in the United States. So it's a big story, especially since the events in Ferguson in 2014, the world has been paying attention to the number of people, primarily black people, killed in the United States by police. And in fact, way back in 2000, the US Congress ordered the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in fact, the Department of Justice, and then through them, the Bureau, to keep track of homicides in the US. Now, I know for Europeans, this is really what do you mean keep track of homicides? Okay, in the US, there are 18,000 separate police departments, all with the right to make arrests. 18,000 police departments. And of those 18,000 police departments, only a fairly small number have any statutory obligation to report crimes to the federal government. There are 3 states where there's state reporting, Connecticut, Texas, and California, but most police departments in the US have no obligation to tell anyone if they kill someone. Not the courts, not the state, no one. Okay? Astonishing, perhaps, to Europeans, but welcome to the federal system of the United States. So Congress, recognizing this, said, hey, Department of Justice, can you do something better? So what they did is they created a media monitoring database, the arrest-related deaths database. And in a literal sense, in order to track police homicides in the United States, the Department of Justice had people reading newspapers. The FBI maintains a second database, the Supplementary Homicide Database, which every year has a little tiny, as an appendix to the Uniform Crime Report, in which they report police homicides. However, the FBI only reports the homicides that they consider legal, which is not really the list we're looking for. So what we end up with is 2 lists. And then in 2013, the Bureau of Justice Statistics asked a think tank in North Carolina to come up with an estimate, because they didn't know, they knew the documentation was too small, come up with an estimate. So they did a version of capture recapture, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And they came up with something like 7,000 odd deaths, little bit less than that. I looked at their analysis and I said, if you do the simple version of capture recapture, you assume that the lists have been collected independently. You assume that the probability of observation in one list is independent of the probability of another list. Okay, I've been using capture recapture for 20 years. It's never been true. Okay, which is why my colleagues and I never do 2-system estimates. So let me talk to you about the math, and then let's kind of unpack it. Okay. This is always my favorite part of the talk. I hope you too will be as enthusiastic about the algebra as I am. We have a population N, which could be the number of people killed in the United States by police in a particular year, or it could be women murdered in Medellin in March of 2003. In order to estimate N, we have 2 lists, call them A and B. And these are lists naming the victims by name and the date and location of their death. And because we are good at machine learning, we can put these lists together, determine the intersection M. Okay? The probability of a death in the population N being documented by Project A is A divided by N, with some assumptions that I'm going to explore in some detail. Okay? Homogeneity of capture probability is the key one there, so we'll kind of unpack that in a second. Second, the probability of a death in the population N being documented by Project B is B divided by N. Similarly, for M, the probability that a death is in both lists being sampled by N is M divided by N. But because M is the result of 2, we're going to assume independent probabilities, that's false, but we're going to unpack it. Then the probability is also the product of the probabilities of A and B. The probability of an event made up of 2 independent events is the product of the individual probabilities. So multiply it out, rearrange the terms, now we can estimate N. All right. We're good, right? So the Bureau of Justice Statistics study should be fine. No, it's not fine, specifically because the independence of observation assumption is false. Observation is governed by social visibility. If someone is very, very visible, particularly if they're, say, a middle-class person in the United States, and they're killed by police, the probability that the media will notice is very high. Similarly, the probability that the FBI will notice is very high. These things are related. The FBI can't really ignore the death of a high visibility person. But in reverse, if the person is very low visibility, particularly if they're an undocumented immigrant or a Black person who's from a very poor community, the media may ignore, less probable now in 2021 than certainly in the period covered by this study, but the media may ignore the killing, and similarly, the FBI will not consider it important and so therefore not document it. So there's a positive correlation between A and B. Okay, that means M is too big. If the probability of observation between the two systems is positive, then the two systems tend to converge, which drives M up. And of course, M is in the denominator, so that drives the estimate N down. So you underestimate the universe of observation when the probability of the correlation in the probabilities is positive. All right. We know all about the correlations in these probabilities because we've been modeling them for years. And the way you do it is you set up a log linear model in order to estimate all of the cell frequencies. I'm going to show you an example of this in just a minute. And then through the log linear model, you get coefficient estimates that give you a way to approximate the correlation in the probabilities between lists in the interaction terms. So with my colleague Christian Lom, and if you want more details on the specific work we did in this is the URL. Send me an email. I can send it to you if you don't capture it here. We found a way to reverse that logic by taking the parameters estimated in the pairwise log linear interaction coefficients and use those to adjust a pairwise model. So we figured out all the estimated pairwise list dependence from all the different pairs of systems that we've observed in a bunch of different countries over the years. And we said, okay, that gives us a range from which we can then simulate the impact of the pairwise list dependence in our analysis. And in our analysis, the Colombian projects were actually the most similar to the United States because we used, from Colombia in particular, we had lists from the media and lists from the state. And that's actually a fairly rare combination in these other countries. And so that was the same as the lists we used in the United States. So we're going to say, okay, for this simulation, the pairwise list dependence is likely, from Colombia is likely the most likely one. So we use that to adjust the pairwise estimates that the Bureau of Justice Statistics had made. And we come up with an estimate of a bit more than 10,000 total deaths over the period here, which comes to a bit less than 1,500 deaths per year. Now, to put that in context, in the United States, there's between 15 and 17,000 homicides a year, plus minus, which means that, but of that, it's really important, I'm sure this is true in Norway too, about 3/4 of all homicides are committed between people who know each other. Most homicides, brother-in-law, six-pack, handgun, boom. That is the story of most homicides in the United States. Of the remaining quarter of people who are killed by strangers in the United States, if you are killed by a stranger in the United States, the single most likely category of person to kill you is a police officer. Not a crazed gunman, not a terrorist, not a gangbanger, a police officer. Let's go to Guatemala. That's Jose Efrain Rios Montt. He was the de facto president of Guatemala from March 1982 until August of 1983, a period during which the Truth Commission in 1999 found that the Army of Guatemala, under his command, had committed acts of genocide against the Maya Ixil people. Okay, if you'll notice, I'm showing this slide I just showed you to the Guatemalan judges. They got it. See the light bulbs go on over their heads. Because judges, in particular judges who think a lot about human rights, are perfectly aware that, that a vast number of human rights crimes are silenced. They go unreported. They're never observed. They know very well about data bias, even if that's not the term they use. So I presented this work to them. And let's talk a little bit about what the work was. First, let's start with the data. We had the census, the Guatemalan census, published in December 1981. I'm very sensitive to the work of many of my demographer colleagues who've done worked on the history of demography in the United States, that censuses are often mechanisms of social repression. As it was in Guatemala, we should ask questions about why there was a census on the eve of genocide. Nonetheless, we have the data. Okay? And so the data are our denominators. The data tell us how many people were alive in the 3 counties of Quetzal, Chajul, and Nebac, the 3 counties in which first the Truth Commission and then later the genocide trial focused about acts of genocide being committed by the army. For the numerators, we had homicide records of people killed by the Army, recorded first by a small human rights NGO, the International Center for Human Rights Research, CIIDH in the Spanish acronym, where I worked from 1994 until about 1996. The Project for the Recuperation of Historical Memory, run by the Catholic Church, REMI, the Truth Commission, the CEH, and the National Program for Compensation, the PNR. And so from those, we deduplicated them. And getting back to that, how you do that whole log linear thing, well, this is your data set. What you do is you organize the data in terms of the intersections that you find in the deduplication. So you've conducted record linkage, and so therefore you know how many records are documented by each combination of projects. So the second line in the table here are those records documented only by the PNR, but not by any of the other three, so 0001. And the bottom line in the table are the records documented by all 4 projects. It is astonishing that in a data set of more than 5,000 records, only 18 records appear in that center intersection, okay? Which tells us a lot about the complexity of the list dependence among these lists, it was very, very complex. And for this estimate, we used a version of capture-recapture known as decomposable graph analysis, which was published first in 1997 by David Madigan and Jeremy York, who are Bayesian statisticians. So this was our first step toward Bayesian analysis. Now we're all the way over that particular transition. So this takes us back to the conclusion. Using that method, we estimated first for the indigenous community and then for the their non-indigenous neighbors, the total deaths. That's shown in the numerators. To a statistician, genocide is about selection. So genocide is not a crime simply of mass violence. Genocide is about focusing. It's about targeting and selection. And so in order for a statistician to talk about genocide, we have to talk about the relative risk of the two communities. Not just the risk of mortality in the target community, but the risk of mortality by homicide by the perpetrator of the non-target community. And so to do this, we calculate the mortality, the total mortality. This is crude mortality. There's no adjustment for age. Crude mortality for the indigenous community, which is about 5.5% in this period, and the crude mortality for their non-indigenous neighbors, which is about 0.7%. The ratio between the two is approximately 8, which we interpret as if you were an indigenous person alive in March of 1982, your probability of being murdered by the Army by August 1983 was approximately 8 times greater than your non-indigenous neighbor. Okay, that's focus. Okay, now using Helge Henrik's work, I did a little crude back of the envelope on the relative risk for Bosnia, and it comes out around 3. And with Eva's work too, I used a bunch of Eva's analysis. And I did something also for the prefecture of Kibuye in Rwanda, and it comes out between Hutu and Tutsi population, comes out to about 5. To put this in comparative perspective, that's a lot of focus that the Guatemalan army brought to bear on this particular conflict. So we did this analysis across several different periods. They're not entirely consecutive because of the way that we tried to match them to some political periods and so forth, and there were some other factors governing the way we did the periodization here. But nonetheless, the mortality rate during Rios Mont's government was much, much higher than under any comparable period. Similarly, not only was the total mortality higher for the indigenous community, but the relative risk was higher. The army was more focused on indigenous people to the exclusion of non-indigenous people during Rios Mont's government than in other periods. And I'm sorry, so that's the Guatemala analysis. I presented that, and that was in 2013, was the first trial. Rios Montt was convicted, and there was a really great page that the judges wrote about why this analysis was instrumental in their ability to rebut the defense's claim that lots of people die in the fog of war. Remember that what perpetrators do is tell grotesque and easily disproven lies. We still have to disprove them, and judges have to disprove those lies, because those are going to be the lies that are the foundation of the defense claims. So we have to say, no, it's not random. It was highly targeted, and the judges understood that. Of course, the Constitutional Court was bribed into overturning the case. A new trial was ordered, and then in the second trial, the defense learned the Milosevic lesson. And the Milosevic lesson is drag the trial out till the defendant dies. And that's what happened. I testified again in 2018. Rios Montt died about 3 weeks later. All right, let's turn to the Philippines. And this is my most recent of these projects. This is a project I did with faculty and students at the journalism school at Columbia University in New York. We had data from 8 sources. 2 of the sources were in fact integrated from a lot of other sources, but we had 8 sources. So we're starting and building up the number of sources, and it turns out there's all kinds of incredibly cool mathematical advantages we get as we keep adding sources. Declining marginal returns happen way out, at beyond a couple of dozen sources at this point. We made estimates for Manila, Quezon City, and Caloocan for the period July 2016 until December 2017. And we're estimating homicides in the drug-related killings by the Philippine police. These are, of course, encouraged by the president. And in fact, police were given bounties for killing people that were accused to be part of the drug trade. And I'll show you that there's an interesting challenge in that maybe people weren't involved in the drug trade. The main outcome from this was not political change or a decision from a trial court, but rather a long-form article in the Atlantic magazine. This was widely discussed in the Philippines, including among legislators, but most importantly among the NGOs and human rights community. But nonetheless, the Philippines was one of the world's great warning signs about rising authoritarian patterns, and violence by police remains very popular, particularly among the Philippine middle class. So now I want to kind of get a little more into the methods, because this is the last example and now we can start unpacking it. One of the places that my colleagues and I always start from is the notion of how do all the intersections look? So we do look at the data first off before we do any estimation or analysis. And the reason we look at the data is to think about how does this very complex Venn diagram end up occurring? And we're really delighted by this new representational form. It's only about 7 or 8 years old, called upsetter graphs. Or they're called upset graphs. The R implementation is called upset R because, as you know, every package has to end in R. Yeah. So anyway, so the way you read this graph is that you read along the bottom, and where you see a dot, that is the source for the bar above it. And in cases where you have multiple dots, that's an intersection among those sources. So, for example, the very first of the bars is the police themselves. So the police in the Philippines published lists of people that they acknowledged to have been killed in this supposed anti-drug conflict. We also had information that the top 4 sources are NGOs. Then there's the religious sources from parish registries. We then had a group of Philippine academics that's been doing really high-level, very high-quality documentation. And then, of course, we scrape the media, which is always what you've got to do. And then you can describe this very complex interaction between all these data sources. We did the matching here by hand. So you don't have to go into the fancy machine learning if you only have 1,000 or 2,000 records. You just need to spend some time doing it by hand. And we can talk more about this. We go both ways. In fact, we always start by hand, doing some work by hand, because that's the training data we use for the machine learning side. And then we work primarily with a package now called Latent Class Models for Capture Recapture, written by Professor Daniel Manrique Valle. Daniel is a Peruvian, which is highly relevant because he worked with us in Peru at the Truth Commission while he was still just a young programmer. And he was so inspired by statistics and the ability to tell the truth with statistics that he went to Pittsburgh and got a PhD with Steven Feinberg, one of the great statisticians, American statisticians of all time, really. And then was a postdoc at Duke University and now is an associate professor of statistics at Indiana University in Bloomington. And he has published a model that he developed with Feinberg that thinks about the capture-recapture problem in a really interesting way, which is to posit a latent class or a set of latent classes for each stratum. And the logic is that if we could separate all of the data into these latent classes, these separate latent classes, for which the independence model obtains, we can solve simultaneously the list independence problem and the capture heterogeneity problem. This is really interesting. Now, our ability to solve the capture heterogeneity problem, which if there's Q&A, we can definitely unpack what I mean by that problem, but it turns out to be somewhat, it's really closely related to list independence, but it's not the same. If we can solve those two problems, we can get an unbiased estimate. We can't always. And I'm showing this slide because we really weren't solving it all the way, or it was very challenging to solve in the Philippine case. So what the graph on the lower right shows, obviously the graph on the upper left is the density plot from the posterior, the sample from the posterior probability. So what it shows is a peak at what looks to be about, I don't know, 560 or so, and then that's the credible interval. And one of the things about this credible interval, this is the 95% equal tail probability distribution for that. And what's interesting about these is that they're never symmetric. If they're multimodal, you have a problem. If they're multimodal, something's wrong. Probably you have uncontrolled heterogeneity that you should solve with either stratification or some other kind of modeling approach. But this is it's close to not to unimodal, but they're always asymmetric. And it's logical that they should be asymmetric because we know the bound on the left. We know the lower bound of these things because we have a list of the people who were killed. We know that's the minimum number of people killed in this stratum. The bound on the right, though, is not so clear. We don't necessarily know what the total number might be on the far right because that is much less straightforward to figure out. So almost all of these models that we estimate with Bayesian methods give us these kinds of asymmetric approaches where we have more uncertainty on the upper bound than on the lower bound. What I want to flag in the graph on the lower right is I was really curious. We have a lot of sources here, and I was like, okay, where's the heterogeneity? I know it's here. I know there are some victims who are wildly likely to be observed and others who are unlikely to be observed. How is that affecting the estimates? And so what I want to explore with this graph is what happens if we drop one of the sources and re-estimate? Okay? What if we drop one of the sources and re-estimate? And each of these curves shows the result of that estimate without one of the sources. So we can see that if we drop these sources, it doesn't change very much. This is the estimate. That's the mean of the distribution with all of the sources. And if we drop these sources, it doesn't change very much. But if we drop this one, or especially this one, we'll get a very, very different estimate. Because with each source we don't have, our ability to control for capture heterogeneity declines. The big lesson here, though, is that heterogeneity creates downward biases. Okay? And that's super useful. Super useful. It's incredibly useful to know the direction of bias, the direction of probable bias. That really gets us halfway there, in my opinion. But in any case, the other lesson you can take away from this is that more sources lead to better estimation. And that's one of the things that has been really valuable because in the first 15 or so years of doing capture recapture in human rights work, we were really limited to 3 or maybe 4, at the most 5 systems. Now we don't really have an upper bound. Now we can actually use as many sources as there is data to pull together. And in Colombia, right now, working for the Truth Commission, we're using, in some cases, 40 sources. So we're using 40 sources in a single model for a single stratum. And that turns out to really give you a lot of granular control of the heterogeneity due to bias. Here are the overall results from Philippines. And so just to kind of take it to the substantive results, to what we have here is region and perpetrator, and then the number of documented deaths, and then the number reported by police. The police are the single biggest source, okay? But there's some real variation, like extraordinary variation in what we document versus what the police report. Sometimes they're not that far apart. Sometimes they're very far apart. And then there's an estimated total, which tends to be somewhat larger than the documented total, because of course not everything gets documented, logically enough. But sometimes that documented total is a lot bigger and sometimes only a little bigger. But what I want to show in the final column is the ratio between the estimation and what the police reported. And it's staggering. If you run your eye down across this, the numbers that really jump out, well, these two, of course, but then this one. What do those have in common? Those are the ones that don't have an identified perpetrator. This is really, really interesting. The police are not telling you about drug-related killings that have an unidentified perpetrator. Now, an unidentified perpetrator in the Philippines probably means a police officer who took off his shirt and put on a different shirt. In fact, we have plenty of reports of these unidentified killings being committed by people wearing Philippine police pants and civilian shirts. So what do we take away from this? Well, of course, we know that the murder of low-level drug users and sellers was encouraged by police commanders and, in fact, by the government going all the way to the president. In fact, the president would go on TV and offer bounties for these killings and paid them. So what's the unidentified perpetrator stuff? Well, those are the killings that the police, we think, thought they could get away with, but weren't going to get them a bounty. So what's that? Well, there's a lot of political scientists in this room, right? It's the principal agent problem. Whenever you give agents the ability to commit violence with impunity, they always do it for their own ends. Always. I defy you to find a single repressive country in the world where the violent forces don't do something with that violence that benefits them directly and is not at all sanctioned by their superiors. It always happens. Whether it's the creation of proto-organized crime groups to extortion, which is the most common thing that happens and probably what's happening here, or individual conflicts between police officers and others, that the police can then use their personal impunity to commit more violence. And I want to highlight this for two reasons. First of all, because I thought it would be really cool to say the phrase principal agent in front of a room full of political scientists. I don't have very many audience who know what that means. But the other thing that I thought is really interesting is to flag that whenever authoritarian governments tell us that they're going to commit violence for some reason, it just always grows. The violence always grows to encompass all kinds of reasons. Violence grows to consume societies, as it is now in the Philippines. I admire academic work immensely, and I'm really, really, really delighted to be here at PRIO today. But I'm not actually an academic. That's not my job. I'm a human rights activist. My job is to use methods that are similar and often shared with academics, often informed by academics, but in the service of human rights arguments, whether that's in court, the court of public opinion, in a truth commission, or for some other more limited advocacy goal. We have to be right. I don't know that I've always gotten it right, but that doesn't lessen one iota the obligation to get it right, because the victims and their families deserve the truth. And we have to do absolutely everything scientifically possible to get there. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Then I think I'll ask our commentators or panel participants to come up. This was really powerful, Patrick, and you're really exploring the distinction between activism and research to a degree that I think we can appreciate and accept. I've asked both Ragnhild Nordås and Marie Osnes to say a few words. They've not been asked specifically to comment on you, but to say something about the way that we work and some of the ways that Ragnhild has worked. Ragnhild is a senior researcher, as I said, at PRIO and also an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, political scientist. And has worked extensively also with data collection, including as a PI for the SVAC project, the Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict data set. So that's her background. Maria is senior advisor in the section for gender equality within the Department for Human Development. There was a little bit of a discrepancy between the English and Norwegian web pages, because in English it's called the Norwegian Department for Welfare and Human Rights. That's a Norwegian sort of translation, but in the English version actually says Department of Human Development. So something got lost in transition, or maybe NORAD, when going out in the world, is trying to sort of depress the human rights angle. I don't know. You'll have a chance to also speak a little bit about the way that NORAD works with human rights and with human rights data and relevance of the work that Patrick and the HRDAG are doing. I think we'll start with you, Ragnhild.
Okay. I'm going to time myself, I think, but you tell me too if I go over time. Thank you very much, Patrick, and congratulations on winning the Rafto Prize. I'm a very big fan of the work that you've been leading in the work of HRDAG. It's been very important, inspiring scholarship. And whenever I hear you talk and whenever I think about the problems that you bring up, I am sort of have divided between hope and the kind of frustrations or despair sometimes about the challenges. So it's hope in all the things that you're able to do and how you're able to get this information to the places where someone can be held to account for these human rights violations. But on the other hand, it's also just the sheer number of challenges associated with that. And so just to make matters worse, for my own work, I've picked a topic where one group of HRDAG connected researchers wrote a very interesting report about a decade ago about trying to say something about sexual violence in the case of Colombia. I've been using that report. I've been reading it many times myself. I've been using it in my teaching, and I see the faces of my students kind of just like drop. And it's like, is this really something we should even try to do research on? And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, and kind of maybe wanting to not challenge you, because, but kind of talk about a class of human rights violations that are maybe even more challenging to study than killings, and just kind of lay out some of the challenges, the problems that I see there. So it could be that after I've talked about all this, and if you want to comment on it, you can say, just dispense with this because it's not going to work. It's too hard. And then I always say, well, yes, it is too hard. I sort of agree, but we still have to. We still have to try. And that's maybe also what people thought about a lot of the human rights violations in the past. Historically speaking, a lot of people even said, human rights, should we even measure it? Should we even use statistics? These are human destinies. These are human lives. We shouldn't even put numbers on it. And I kind of have the opposite. I'm kind of, if we count things, if we take it seriously, if we use our best methods, that's really taking seriously what's happened to people. And so that's what we need to do. So even if we are maybe so far from where we need to be, we still have to march in the right direction here. Maybe I shouldn't use march, it's too militaristic. We're maybe a little bit further along today, a decade later, maybe. I've been working with people from HRDAG or that have sort of come from your group, and they've been very inspirational to me, and I think they've sort of helped push this along a little bit. But with sexual violence, this is a type of human rights violations which is arguably particularly hard to measure. And especially when we want to do it systematically and comparably, but even in one single case. So it encompasses a lot of different types of violations. It's not necessarily resulting in deaths, but it can. It's not, we think, very well proxied by killings. So we can't just say, let's just proxy it by killings. That doesn't seem to work. So we need to look at it in its own right. But in this case, we are also faced with the challenge that those who have been victimized, those who are survivors, and maybe even their families and their communities, do not necessarily want to have the information about the specifics come out. There's a lot of taboos here. There's a lot of risk of repercussions, social repercussions or otherwise. So it's not so that there are perpetrators that are trying to keep things hidden. Yes, we have that. But we might also have survivor populations who are also interested in maybe having someone put to justice or having in general the problem put on the agenda, but there's a personal risk involved. So that's a statistical problem as well, and a problem of bias, where there are certain types of victims that might be more likely to end up in our data, and for others, the risk is too high. So those are things that maybe we have to think about for that specific problem in a different way than for killings. There's also maybe descriptions of things when it's sexual violence, that's more vague language, more in narrative form. You sort of have to look for the evidence in a slightly different way. It's not just a sort of a list of who died or who didn't die. You can be victimized several times. Some die, some don't die. Certain types of events, again, that are bigger, more public, more violent, might have more reporting afterwards, and others might have much less, because there's a chance you have the possibility of not disclosing if it's not so that everyone in the community knows that this happened. It matters who the victim is. In some instances, we think that maybe there's a slight over-reporting of children as victims because they are presumed innocent or that they did not ask for it, which is very often presumed or something that a woman in particular might kind of worry about when reporting. And what are the chances of justice? Very poor chances of justice, so why bother, right? So I'm wondering about how, for my own personal interest, how do we deal with these types of human rights problems? Is there anything in what you've done and all your experience that can give me some more glimmer of hope today compared to a decade ago to help me tackle this really challenging problem? So since I've run out of time, I'm going to stop there. But thank you so much for a very inspiring talk.
Thank you very much. Maria.
Thank you. As my colleague Håvard already said, NORAD's new strategy, so the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, calls for evidence to have power and evidence-based decision-making. But for this to happen, we need to have data-backed evidence. In a world with information overload, information apparently available on one click, there's the issue of whose information can you actually trust, like you've already touched upon. Who's produced and published the so-called fact or evidence? Who will benefit from that information circulating? As we've heard today, these are some of the underlying issues that HRDAG addresses by working with sound scientific methods and statistical analysis to help human rights defenders make their case and speak truth to power. Shedding light on the challenges relating to data collection and analysis, revealing and making these methods available is a valuable contribution for practitioners like NORAD seeking to base their work on knowledge and evidence. In particular, it's valuable to get access to trustworthy analysis of the magnitude of particular human rights violations in settings where data gathering is particularly challenging. For those of you not familiar with the work of NORAD, NORAD has a broad mandate to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and we work systematically within many sectors and with many actors to support human rights. Norway is an avid supporter of the multilateral system, but we also work bilaterally with different partner countries and support civil society organizations working diligently to ensure participation, non-discrimination and equality, the empowerment of different groups, and to ensure the rule of law and accountability. Within statistics and statistical analysis, we actually have designated institutional cooperation programs where Statistics Norway works peer-to-peer with their sister organizations to systematically strengthen the national statistical offices in producing high-quality data through, amongst other sources, censuses and surveys, and to provide good statistical analysis. Strengthening national statistical offices is one part of ensuring that countries can build up a baseline and data on their population and their needs, and as such constitutes an indirect contribution towards strengthening the capacity of duty bearers to fulfill their population's rights to be held accountable should they fail in this endeavor. This, however, is based on the assumption that truth leads to accountability. However, having the truth is not enough without the political will, like we've already heard, to also use the data or truth constructively to fulfill rights. Statistics can be manipulated and provide misleading representations of reality, depending on what gets counted and how data is framed, like you've illustrated today, Patrick. As the famous quote says, lies, damned lies, and statistics. Herein lies the many gray zones of statistics as truth. Numbers are political. Human rights are political. Coupling the two makes for highly sensitive and potentially dangerous material. Not knowing the demographics of your country may sometimes be an active choice as having or acknowledging facts or knowing. Reliability of data depends on the methods of data gathering, what is counted and how. In Ethiopia, the ongoing conflict has called for investigations into human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence. Who do the investigators have access to? Who is willing to take the risk and speak up? Where or what areas are they allowed into? Or a different example, like HRDAG has published papers on, registering COVID-19 deaths. What is the magnitude? Do you die of or with COVID-19? Reliability of data also depends on cultural norms and practices. Ragnhild has touched upon that. In countries where you have to, for instance, physically meet up to register births, and maybe you have to walk for long stretches, you might prioritize your baby boy. He counts. But maybe you don't think it's worth it to walk that long stretch for your girl child. When truth does not lead to accountability, it could instead lead to increased impunity, apathy, and distrust of decision makers. The independent South African press, for instance, reveals corruptions almost on a weekly basis, but it mostly does not lead to investigations and convictions unless it involves a political enemy. So to ameliorate some of these challenges, NORAD supports initiatives to collect both qualitative and quantitative evidence. We work mostly on capturing dimensions of discrimination in regular data collection for monitoring and policy development. We support the development of tools, systems, and capacity for disaggregating data to capture parities and inequity. In this work, civil society also plays an important role in collecting and providing decision makers with data on marginalized populations. I'd like to draw on one recent example called the COVID-19 Disability Rights Monitor that collected testimonies and examples of human rights violations against persons with disabilities in government's COVID-19 responses. A consortium of several civil society organizations identified a need to provide information in real time when information from governments was lacking. It's survey-based and faces several methodological challenges, such as a lack of a sampling strategy, and so cannot provide a complete picture. Yet it has succeeded in showcasing examples of human rights violations and indicating scale. The examples have been used to initiate dialogue and highlight the problem, but the data has not been oversold nor overused, which is good. Another, before I come soon to a close, another example I'd like to draw on is NORAD's supports to the UNFPA, so the UN's Population Fund. They're doing some important work on providing accurate statistics and analysis on sex ratios in selected countries, including countries like Nepal and Vietnam, known for gender-biased sex selection and related harmful practices and so-called sum preference. They've worked closely with demographic researchers such as Christophe Guilmoteau on finding manners in which to calculate sex ratios accurately. In particular, faced with challenges such as incomplete and unreliable birth registration statistics, which therefore need to be complemented by other sources, including censuses. This work has been important for organizations in dialogue with governments to reveal the scale of the problem and initiate policy changes. Moreover, this information gathering cannot be a one-off exercise. It needs to be continuous, preferably annually, in order to monitor the developments. So the UNFPA has therefore worked with governments to improve the quality of the data sources and methods to monitor the prevalence of these discriminative practices that result in fewer girls being born and surviving compared to boys if all things are left to their natural developments. We need timely data, here and now, in addition to the retrospective analysis that, for instance, HRDAG provides. Often, we require information that is timely to act here and now, such as in the case of COVID-19. So as a provider of development finance and as a public sector institution, we also need to be cognizant of how information can be distorted, manipulated, and used politically, but also that we need to support a variety of actors, including civil society, a free press, journalists, researchers, and state actors. So in conclusion, we need this variety of actors to provide reliable evidence in both qualitative and quantitative forms for decision makers, including ourselves, both to ensure the fulfillment of human rights and prevent abuse. To end on one of your statements, maybe you not personally, but your organization, Patrick, seeking justice behind the numbers. This is how we can ensure that numbers, facts, and evidence hold the power to improve people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fagia. Patrick, did you want to respond to anything, any of the comments?
I mean, I'd love to engage the challenge that that Ragnhild put down for us, because I think it's a really good one, around measuring sexual violence, because it's super hard, but I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was 10 years ago, maybe even a little more optimistic than I was 6 months ago. So nothing new, but I have to say 2 of my colleagues are working on me a little bit, and they've moved me a little bit. But let me lay out what I think the challenges are here. First of all, unlike homicide, sexual violence is an act that is often known only to the perpetrator and the victim. It's not something that necessarily the rest of the community knows about. Homicides leave a social hole, and so the community knows, and so there's more people who can tell you about it. Generally, when we are trying to find out about sexual violence, we have to learn about it from the victim. We have to learn about it from the victim, but you know, we don't call people who survive sexual violence victims, we call them survivors. But not all of them are, and that's the second problem. Some of them, if we're going to find out, they die in the course of the violation, and so our chance of finding out about that declines. And this is especially problematic if we're trying to measure something and then make a comparison, because if we're trying to compare, for example, in a particular country context, sexual violence in the context of a conflict and the sexual violence in the context of civilian sexual violence, well, if one of them is more violent than the other, usually the ones in conflict, and they leave fewer victims, we're less likely to learn about those. Our statistics are going to be very difficult to assess. There's also a problem that similarly, that goes the other way, actually, in terms of the civilian conflict kinds of sexual violence. And this occurs when we talk to people who are survivors of sexual violence in an interview, maybe in a probabilistic interview or in a qualitative interview. And if she, and here I'll just think about women, I know often, and particularly in Central Africa, we have a large population of adolescent boys who are also victims of sexual violence, but I'll focus on women victims here. If she has suffered this, so it's just conditional on her having experienced a sexual violence event, what is her probability of disclosing it at the point where you ask her? Now, let's assume she's a rational and competent reasoner about her world. She's going to make an assessment. What's the benefit to her of disclosing? She may want to please the interviewer. And people do. I want to please interviewers when I'm interviewed. I'm like, yes, I do not support the recall of District Attorney Chesa Boudon. Okay, that's just my little political plug from San Francisco. Anyway, I do not support the recall, so to speak. So, you know, she has a decision to make about whether or not she's going to disclose. And so she says, well, on the one hand, I would like to tell the interviewer if it's true, what benefits might accrue to me if that happened? Well, there might be some benefits, but what if I don't tell the interviewer? What harm could come if I tell them? So why might I not want to disclose? And what a really innovative study, which is now more than 10 years old, done at Columbia University by the Mailman School of Public Health people, comparing Central African Republic and Uganda, is they figured out through a really interesting measurement scheme, which I can go into detail if there's Q&A. I think you probably know the neighborhood disclosure method, in which they figured out that women are very likely to disclose sexual violence when they know their neighbors already know about it. But if their neighbors don't know about it, they almost never will disclose it. Okay, look. When sexual violence happens in the context of conflict, it's often very public. And so everyone in the village already knows, so that you don't really have much to gain concealing it because everyone already knows. But when it happens and it's your neighbor or your relative, maybe no one but you and him know. And so you have everything to gain keeping it secret, which means that there's now a systematic difference in your probability of disclosing a conflict or non-conflict event, which completely distorts our understanding of conflict versus non-conflict sexual violence. I mean, completely. It means that we are vastly overstating the relative importance of conflict violence relative to endemic civilian sexual violence. This is the story of Central Africa, of CAR, of Congo, of Uganda, of Burundi. This is the story that the world has been telling itself for 15 years. And it's, oh, the conflict is generating all this sexual violence. Well, sexual violence is endemic in the society. There's a lot of sexual violence in the conflict, but there's a lot more in the civilian context that we're just not documenting because we've developed a method that tautologically reproduces the thing that the study authors, I think, designed. That they thought, oh, there's all this conflict-related sexual violence, let's go measure it. And then they found it, and they're like, QED, our work is done. And that is really problematic if we're going to try to think about interventions. It's also problematic if we care about the truth, but here I'm thinking about humanitarian assistance, and it really messed up our understanding for a long, long, long time. And when those studies were coming out at the time, I was working in the Joint Human Rights Office of the UN in Kinshasa, and really literally right next to our office was the Sexual Violence Coordination Group. And I became friends with the woman who was running it at the time, and she's like, so you're a statistician? I'm like, yep. And she said, what, all these studies? So we organized a little seminar where we started unpacking the statistics of the studies, and we didn't find any of them that were even vaguely plausible because of problems like this, like the problem with bias due to the death of the victim and bias due to disclosure bias. The other thing that makes sexual violence super hard to measure is that unlike homicide, it can happen to someone more than once. And as a consequence, you have to think about what are you counting? When you're doing the measurement, are you counting victims of sexual violence or acts of sexual violence? And those are very hard to unpack when you're asking something, because, I mean, how much trauma do you want to evoke in an interview? Do you want to say, was that the only time you were assaulted? Well, tell me about all the other times. I mean, good Lord, can you imagine the trauma in these interviews? It's very, very challenging. So those are all the problems. That was in our volume that we published in 2011. I want to name the people who wrote it because I think they're amazing. Tammy Guberek, Amelia Hoover-Green, and most recently, Maria Gargiulo, who's done amazing, amazing work on this stuff. So I'm a little tiny bit more optimistic now. And the reason I am is that there's a new family of methods that will not solve the death of the victim bias. I don't know that we have a way to solve that. And it won't directly get at the multiple assault problem, although it might get at it indirectly. And these are probabilistic disclosure methods. In these kinds of methods, victims are not asked about their experiences. They're asked about some experiences of someone they know. Okay, and they get a series of ways they can either vote on whether or not something's true, or they can disclose it in a way that's very indirect. And the reason this method is so interesting is that it produces the correct statistical distributions, but in a way that makes it impossible for the survey takers to link the particular report with a specific victim. So we don't actually know who told us what in the interview process. Now, this is all super experimental stuff. I have a proposal in my bag if people would like to do. I would love to share it with you. The people that I'm working with this on are Millie Lake at the London School of Economics and Livia Schubinger at Duke University. And I think Millie and Livia are incredibly smart and interesting. And I'm really, really excited to see this go forward and to see what we can learn from it. So I'd love to share that with people if there's some interest in it. So I'm a tiny bit more optimistic. We haven't solved everything, but that's not how science works, right? Science works where we solve one piece at a time, and eventually maybe we'll get some better measures. The conclusion of that book that was referred to earlier is not that we are saying we should not study sexual violence because it's unimportant. It's the other way around. It's that sexual violence is so important that we must get it right. And so at HRDAG, we won't do it until we're convinced that we can get it at least most of the way right.
Thank you, Patrick. We're going to open the floor in a second, but I wanted, so feel free to start thinking about posing a question and even raising your hand in a second. But I wanted to get back to some of the sort of broader implications of the work that you're doing, Patrick, and the HRDAG. So the ambition being to bring perpetrators, to bring war criminals to justice, and to keeping leaders and governments accountable. And I got this picture in my head when you started talking about how you were explaining Bayesian statistics to judges in international courts. And you mentioned you've been giving testimony 6 times to international courts and processes. And I had the pleasure of being an expert witness for the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in the case that DRC has against Uganda, which also is over reparations, Ugandan reparations to DRC for Ugandan control and sort of abuses and damage in the Ituri province in the DRC during the conflict. And I did the simple stuff on sort of presenting the conflict data, the death, the mortality data we have from the Uppsala conflict database, which again is, you know, in a sense is a sort of a minimum number based on mostly news reports, but also organizations. And then Debbie Guas-Appier did sort of more in-depth mortality, so excess mortality presentation. And I was just very impressed by, this was only the third time that the ICJ had asked external expert witnesses since the beginning of the, you know, some 1950s.
Yeah.
And talking to some international lawyer friends, I got the impression that this is something that, you know, perhaps is signaling an increased willingness both to take into account sort of more complex research-based evidence, but also perhaps, you know, a willingness to try to engage that material in a constructive and open way. And I was really impressed with how they were even, you know, asking intelligent questions about excess mortality estimates. What is your, you know, impression from the situations where you've been, you know, presenting to court? I mean, is this something that we can be hopeful about? What is the prospects for bringing, you know, the human rights data into courts and by that, you know, propelling these legal processes internationally? Are you as optimistic when it comes to that?
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. So to be clear, I have 4 international cases and 2 domestic. So 2 of my cases have been in Guatemalan domestic courts, so not international context. And what I'd say is, overall, I'd say my record is 3 wins, 2 ties, and a loss. Okay, where the ties are what happens when the accused dies during the course of the trial. You don't get a finding. There's 2 things that really have to happen for this to work. First, as you note, the judges have to care about the truth. Okay? And that, I'd say, in 5 of the 6 trials, judges really cared what the truth was. In 1, he didn't care at all, really. I mean, quite overtly. In the second trial, Dr. Ball, he said 5 minutes into my testimony, some of us studied the law because we were poor at maths. Like, you're judging a case about policy, and you're going to say 5 minutes into an expert's testimony that you have no idea how statistics works? Like, that's going to be funny? Like, that's not disqualifying in some way? Right. So moving on, the other thing that really has to happen, other than the judges caring about the truth, is that the prosecutor has to understand what you're saying. And that's generally been true. But, you know, when things go wrong, they all go wrong together. So in that same case, the prosecutor oversold what I said. And overselling, when you said that, I was like, we can't do that. I mean, you have to have the prosecutor understand that when you say something like, we find the evidence to be consistent with the prosecution's hypothesis, you are not saying at all that you have proven the case. The judges are the finders of fact, not the expert at all. And furthermore, observational statistics don't give us causality. So let's be clear about what we're finding, and we can reject hypotheses for sure, but we have to get the prosecutor to understand this fine distinction that if there are hypotheses that have been suggested, that we can reject them, but we're not affirming something other than to observe consistency with what the prosecution has said. The prosecution is telling a story, that's their theory about the case. You can then make that theory into statistical form and figure out if the evidence is consistent with it. Sure. Absolutely. And if the evidence is consistent, that should be a tiny additional grain of sand in favor of the prosecution's argument, but it is not somehow a proof. And if the prosecutors get themselves to a place where they think that they're going to prove the case with a single witness, you're doomed. You're doomed, because that will offend the hell out of the judge, because a smart judge is going to know that's not what you've just done. And if you're a responsible scientist, you will also know that you can't say that. That's not what the science supports. So you have to say something that's much more modest than that. And so those are the conditions. Now, those 2 things said, I think that the limiting factor on the use of quantitative evidence in trials is not so much judicial willingness or prosecutorial competence, it's the existence of those trials. We have a much larger problem in the world today, that the world's commitment to universal rights and justice is declining rather precipitously. So we have a much larger problem, I think, than just does our evidence fit. We're not going to have trials to put our evidence into, notwithstanding a much more as the US Army used to say, target-rich environment for those of us who study mass violence. We're going to be really busy in the coming years. But are we going to have trials? Well, probably not during my career.
Thanks. Do we have any questions? And posing a question also comes with having to stand up and be relatively outspoken, because we have microphones up here, and they're very good, and they're gonna be able to get what you say and also get it out in on the web. But please speak out, Henrikas.
Yes.
And please just present yourselves.
Yes, my name is Henrikas Bartosevičius. I'm a senior researcher here at Rio. And you've already discussed this partly, but I'm interested in what are, if any, good techniques to ask sensitive questions in more standard surveys that we could deliver to citizens sampled from the overall population. I'm just curious if you come across what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
My opinion is that's exactly the direction of the new work that I proposed that we're going to be circulating, and I can send you that. I have to say my colleagues lead that. I'm just doing some of the back end work. We're going to try to do some other stuff too that is my piece, but I want to refer you to the work that Livia and Millie are flagging, and that other statisticians develop these methods, and now political scientists are thinking about how to apply these methods in this context. So I can send you that paper if you want to send me an email. I'll send you our little blurb, and then you can look through the references there. But I'm not an expert in them. I'm really excited by them, though, and I think that they may solve part of the problem.
If the question askers can either go to that side or this side, then the people online can hear a bit better.
Great.
Okay.
They report back.
No. Questions? More questions? So, Håkon.
I'll go to this side then. Hi, my name is Håkon. I'm a senior researcher as well. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I was thinking about on one of the first slides, you had this, when you showed the correlation between the number of sources and the number of deaths. Graph.
The size of the event.
Right. And you have a zero problem, right?
That's right.
You can't observe the zeros. But the zero problem is also kind of more complex. I assume that in a lot of the projects you do, you kind of know what geographical units to look at. Like you're going to look at Ituri or like some area of the globe. So you know that there's probably some kind of human rights violations ongoing there. But there could be areas on the globe where there's no reporting of the human rights violations going on. And that's more complex zero problem where you don't know where to look. So you're looking at places where there are human rights violations, and there you can observe, there you can estimate the missing numbers. But then there will be places where there are nothing that gives us a clue that there are some missing numbers here. Do you have any techniques for trying to find those?
So we don't work on big N.
Okay.
At all. In fact, I'm skeptical of the enterprise. Okay, I work on tiny N. I work one country at a time, and generally not even on the whole country. I work on very specific contexts. My partners are the human rights groups involved who've been documenting the deaths. They drive all of our focus. So I'm not really theoretically motivated in the way that an academic has to be. An academic has a series of theories that she's working on, and that's what she's doing. I'm not at all that way. I am driven by what my partners think an important question of fact is that will change the debate in their country in favor of human rights. And so they define for me the things that we're looking at, the context, the time period, the kind of homicide or disappearance, or in our newer projects, kidnapping, illegal recruitment of minors, and forced displacement. They define what those questions are. They define what the important comparisons are for the statistics to illuminate. And so I never have places that I'm not looking and so don't find, because my partners are always pointing me there. Now, certainly what we have, and the whole point of our work, is to illuminate areas where documentation is weaker relative to areas where documentation is stronger. So for example, the very brief example I put up about Peru is one of those examples where before the work of the Truth Commission, people thought that Sendero Luminoso had only killed a few people. Now, there were a lot of reasons people thought that. One is that the history of the 1980s and the 1990s of insurgent violence in Latin America was that insurgents killed many fewer people in just about every country in Latin America than the state. The state killed wildly more people in Guatemala or in El Salvador. or in many other countries, in Argentina, than did the insurgents. The insurgents killed many, many fewer. Factor of 10, factor of 20 difference between the two. So in Peru, the hypothesis was, well, Sendero killed some people, but not that many. Furthermore, Sendero's deaths were largely way up in the highlands, in rural communities that were very reluctant to tell anybody the story. Furthermore, there were documentation efforts that were specifically focused on the state because there were legal things that a victim of state violence could do that a victim of Sendero had no ability to affect Sendero. So there was no legal recourse for a victim of Sendero. There was compensation you could obtain from the state if a killing was ruled illegal. So you had all kinds of motivation, and there was all kinds of documentation apparatus to document violence by the state that did not exist for Sendero. There was really no systematic documentation of violence by Sendero until the Truth Commission. So the Truth Commission comes along and they find people documenting wildly more violations by Sendero than the state. And they're like, oh boy, this is really different than we expected. We better figure out what's going on here. And so we got together and they contacted me and we got together and we built the model and it became clear what's happening. Subsequent to that, about 3 years later, another big project of the Colombian state did an enumeration of victims of the conflict. Another ministry did that for other purposes. And we got a copy of that database, and that database replicated the patterns that we had found in the Truth Commission and that we had subsequently estimated. So now I think it's really clear that we have both just observational data and estimations that confirm this finding that Sendero killed a lot more people than the state. Okay, and this is, continues to be a question of some academic research. There's a new study by Das, Kennedy, and Jewell, which is just an archive. I assume it's under review somewhere, that goes to confirm some aspects of our study, but not others, but with completely different methods. What they're doing, they're mathematical statisticians, all of them. And what's really fascinating about this new study is they've come up with a way to use other covariate information to adjust two-system estimates. So I warned you all about, you can't just use two systems because you can't control list dependence. That was my example around police homicides in the US. Well, maybe you can if you have other covariate information on the cases. And what this Das, Kennedy, and Jewell paper is doing is finding ways to do that. And I think that's really exciting. And in the paper, they use the Peru example, and they confirm some of our findings with this totally new, different method.
Helge, first.
Thank you. Perhaps a bit technical question for Patrick. You
That's my
started by
favorite.
saying that
Present yourself, please, Helge.
that large events in the Iraq body count were more likely to be reported because of many sources. But isn't it also the case then that large events are likely to be duplicated and appear several times in the body count, because in the Iraq body count you have both individual events with name and place of the victims, but you also have aggregate numbers,
right.
40 kills and 50 kills.
Right.
So how do you know that it's not the same aggregate event that has been happening, reported several times by different media?
Right.
Sometimes 40 kills, sometimes 45 kills, and
Yep.
it's a tangle.
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem. So to kind of unpack Helga's concern, which is spot on and is in fact the centerpiece of an ongoing argument that I'm having with the Iraq body count, is what do we do when you get a report that was very common in the Iraq body count data and is, it's important information. For example, if you get a media report that says 17 people killed around Baghdad today, well, what events were they in? Were those individual? Or you get a dump a dump of data from the Iraqi state saying, okay, we found this many cadavers in the last month, and they don't tell you where or what day of the month. You just get a count of cadavers that they've collected. We call those in our analysis composite events. So they're not an event. It's some report made up of lots of events, and we exclude those entirely from our analysis because those are not deduplicatable. There's no way to figure out how that intersects with other events. Similarly, when we get reports in our other data sets that are missing key pieces of information. So for example, if we get a report of 4 victims but no names, that's not data to us because you cannot figure out if it's duplicated with anything else. So that's information, but it's not really data. It's just kind of a rumor. And I consider composite events kind of rumors, and we excluded all the composite events from our analysis so that we only included the events that could be deduplicated, that were clearly events that were reported, not composites. So that's how we responded to that. I'm very, very worried about this composite event problem, and it has caused an ocean of confusion and misunderstanding in the analysis, I think, of not just Iraq, but of lots of different places. I think it's a really problematic kind of information to grapple with. I think you were my review committee when we were struggling with this problem in Kosovo. Like we thought we could use the composite information in Kosovo as a kind of sensitivity analysis on some of our estimates. Yeah, I never made sense of it. And that whole section of the appendix, I'm embarrassed we ever wrote. It's just not, you just can't make any sense of that kind of reporting, I think.
This is, of course, a well-known issue for many of the data sources that we're using and compiling. Ragnhild, you were nodding.
No, yes,
Anything that you would like to add on the? when it comes to the sort of relevance for SPAC data and other.
I'm just recognizing the same problems,
Yeah.
and kind of like how, in a way, is it fair, or is it more right to take them out to make it more clean? You know what you have because you had a stricter, more conservative rule. Or should you include it because you have some information that something else was going on that's not captured, so you know that your data is not the totality of what happened, but it's the decision rule is then much more vague. So
I actually feel the decision rule is much more precise if you define what constitutes data. And then say, well, to know data, I need to have like a location, and I need.
That's what I meant too. It's like, and that's a sort of conservative rule that we've used too for very different type of data, not at all events data per se, but where if there is no named organization in the reports and we don't know exactly when things happen, so different things like that something happened, we can't pin it on anyone. We have to throw it out. So we know it's a conservative estimate, and we always have to say reported data rather than saying somehow signaling that this is the actual what happened. And then also we're sort of going in the opposite direction, or maybe it's not the opposite direction, using ordinal scales rather than some specific number. Even if we were to construct a number, we wouldn't be confident that this was anywhere. This would signal a false sense of precision. And so instead of doing that, we just instead went to ordinal, where we feel this is at least we can feel more confident that we are not completely mixing, like a 1 and a 3 are not the opposites, but we don't know how big is the 3 relative to the 2 in this ordinal.
I think that's exactly the right thing to do. Honestly, I really think that's a smart thing to do. Now, if there are any doctoral students looking for a dissertation idea, let me throw one out, because I think Iraq body count presents an exciting dissertation idea. And it is a class of models used in population ecology called species richness models. And in species richness models, we count the number of times a given species occurs in a sample, and then we count across all the species that we're observing how many times each is observed, and there's modeling that allows us to estimate how many species were never observed. Events. So I feel like the Iraq body count data could be amenable to a species richness model, in particular because there's additional covariate information in the Iraq body count that could enable a species richness estimate that would allow you to correct for the world media's selection bias. And this would be really interesting, and you could use this to examine media attention as well as patterns of violence in Iraq in a way that would give you at least some kind of estimate correcting for selection bias in the media attention problem. And I've been meaning to do it. It's been on my to-do list for 9 or 10 years. So I'm not getting to it. So if someone else would like to get to it, I think, and there's really there's been extraordinary advance in species richness models, because population ecologists are, of course, quite rightly freaking out over species collapse due to climate change. So, okay, that's terrible. Yeah, the world's full of terrible things, and we study homicide here after all. So, but the math that's coming out of that is amazing. So there's really cool new methods that could really, I think, help us with data sources that are like the Iraq body count to get better analysis. Just my warning is about the raw data. But the raw data is great, but you just can't stop there. You can't use that as the indicator. You have to keep moving.
So Magia, I'm gonna the diversity here in terms of data sources, the diversity in terms of reliability of the numbers that we're using, the small print, and I think that this goes back to what Patrick started out saying. it's great with the Iraq body count if you know what you can use it for and what you shouldn't be using it for. So the challenge for, especially for policy, wanting to use data systematically in order to inform the policies. How do you deal with that? It's a bit of an unfair question and very large and broad, but do you read the small print?
Yes, we do. We do. We want to, but I'm sure we also fail at it. I think we have to acknowledge that we're only human, and in an ideal world, we'd be all researchers and looking at all the fine print and really digging deep into all the sources. But sometimes time is of the essence, and we have to act on imperfect information and imperfect data. But that's why we also rely on talking to and supporting so many different actors in the hope that, call it triangulation or call it just a kind of seeing if the same information pops up several places to then see if it's reliable, basically.
Can I propose a more approachable ideal world? Okay, I do not think that all people should become statisticians. I want to see fewer people, and I am entirely and absolutely serious, I want to see fewer people taking statistics classes. Let me suggest instead, what I would like a lot more people to do, a whole lot more people to do, is to be taking statistics appreciation classes. Look, when we teach people about art, we don't hand them a paintbrush. Okay? If we teach people about music, we don't ask them to learn to play the violin. Okay? It is catastrophic to ask people to learn about statistics and try to teach them equations. That is nightmarish. I have spent my whole life going around, well, I do statistics. Oh, I hated statistics. You're like, all right, look, let's not reproduce that. No more hackathons, no more weekend boot camps. I don't want to hear any more lightweight engagements on quantitative training until somebody can train just say, oh, well, bring all your people who know how to read and write. And on the weekend, we'll teach them to be lawyers to bring cases to their Supreme Court. And until we can do that, I don't want to see any more of these lightweight engagements on statistical or quantitative methods. That's absurd. Statistics is hard. So let's have some division of labor. Let's share the tasks. Some people, a few people, can go really deep in data science. We can get really good at statistics. We can understand uncertainty. We can spend a lot of time in the fine print. We can worry about variances. We can wake up at night going, oh my God, did I propagate the variance from the imputation all the way into the estimates, or did I drop it? Okay, that's a reasonable nightmare for me to have. That is not a reasonable nightmare for anybody who's not a statistician to ever have. Okay, the worst thing we can possibly do is create another dashboard. Stop. And instead, let's think really, really hard about teaching people to read statistics, okay? And this would be done the same way we teach art and music. We teach people to read statistics by reading it together and teaching them what the right questions are to ask of a great study, to recognize what a really great study says. Oh, wow, look, they really talked about how they did the sampling. And look at this, they actually talked about the sampling weights. Look, I can explain sampling to anybody, and there's not an equation in the room. I do it all the time. I have a couple of different exercises I do about how sampling works. And light bulbs go on over people's heads. They want to know. They want to learn this stuff. But if you try to teach them whether it's the sum of the squared errors or the errors of the sum of the square, then they come out and they just very smugly tell you for the rest of their life that they studied the law because they were poor at maths. Okay? That is not helping anyone. And we have to stop. And so the people in this room who are competent statisticians and competent quantitative analysts of social data, I urge you to let's think really hard about how we can create coursework, formal coursework in universities for statistical appreciation, not literacy, because that implies we're going to teach people to do things that they will only do in an amateurish way and get themselves in trouble. They will discredit their work with crap analysis later. They'll get a data set, they download it off the internet, get their intern who's good at Excel to make them a graph, and they'll think that they've got a finding. Catastrophe. I mean, it's funny until it's an organization whose advocacy now rests on that claim, and it gets discredited trivially. So statistical appreciation, yay, lots more of it. Data science, statistics, much less and much deeper, much, much deeper.
Okay.
Yeah. I agree. I'm not going to become a statistician.
Bravo, no need.
No, but that appreciation and learning how to analyze the statistics, I think, is really important, because even though we have a lot of highly educated colleagues in my organization, sometimes it's not for everyone to understand the numbers or to do that analysis. And then we are reliant on other organizations to have done the analysis for us. But I'd also like to draw on an example in a program that unfortunately now is going to halt because of the situation in Ethiopia. But Statistics Norway, the Norwegian Agency for Children, Youth and Family Affairs, and our Ministry of Culture is working together with the Central Statistics Agency in Ethiopia and the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs in Ethiopia to create that dialogue between the two institutions on what information, data, statistics exists within the statistical office and how can the ministry use that. Because the staff working in the ministry, they're not necessarily able to exploit all the data and information that is there that they need for their policymaking. And then creating that bridge and coordinating between those institutions as part of one of our institutional cooperation programs. But that's in one of our partner countries, but we need that here as well. So yeah, and I had another point, but sorry. Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. I mean, he did research on Harvard students, highly educated. I mean, together with Amos Tversky, they won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years back. They proved to us that we're really bad statisticians.
Even statisticians are bad statisticians.
Exactly, and so we need to be reminded of that. Yeah.
I would like to say that NORAD and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have designed a mechanism for also trying to partner with research environments. They have a framework agreement now that they systematically use in order to try to sort of buy research in the areas where they don't necessarily have the competence themselves. So that's I think very forward-leaning way of trying to bridge that gap between the needs for knowledge and the sort of high quality knowledge that's out there in the research organizations. I have a few names on the list: Jonas, Jürgen, Miriam, and I think that's about what we're going to be able to get to. First, Jonas.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jonas Westby. I'm a senior researcher at PRIO. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I think you partly answered my question with your last entry, but so in the last months I've been working with data on internally displaced persons globally, and that is one of the hardest, most difficult data I've seen, with the uncertainty both on the lower band, on the higher band, missing data everywhere. There's multimodal stuff going on. It's terrible. Yet this data is being used a lot and reported on and analyzed as if it was some kind of ground truth. And I want you to just give me the answer to. My question is, how can we cultivate interest in the data we don't have among public, among policy, among researchers?
There you go, Patrick.
Right. Okay, so how to cultivate that interest? Well, here I am. I'm trying. I mean, I don't really have a whole lot of great ways to talk about it, but I mean, one of the ways we can talk about it is just to kind of start literally talking about it. Do we have all the data? We don't have all the data. Okay, well, it's good enough. You're saying to me. Okay, well, okay, let's come back to that. What do you think we don't have? And people start telling stories. And if you kind of let the room go on the what you don't have for a while, yeah, a lot we won't have. And there's a lot of stories that'll come up. Well, we don't have this. Well, we don't have the data from very many women. We don't have this data. We don't have this marginalized community. We don't have that data. We didn't even get to that region. And it'll start coming out. And you just kind of provoke that conversation. And after you do that for a while on a particular context, particularly with people who know something about that, you can say, well, why does this data tell us? What does it actually tell us? It doesn't tell us about any of those things. And they're like, well, it maybe tells us about men who live near the capital and are literate. Whew, okay, that's not much, is it? And maybe we don't even know them. We're just speculating that we even have that data. So, I mean, there's sometimes a way that you can provoke that conversation without even saying the word sampling or bias or distribution, let alone Bayesian updating with new information. I mean, And that's what I try to do when I'm engaging with non-technical people. First of all, assume that they know a lot, because they do. They don't know what you know, but I don't know what they know. So what we try to do is I try to elicit what they know in the context of showing them what I'm worrying about. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I don't have a super clear way to do it. It's interesting with displaced data, you know, when I'm looking at Colombia, which I'm working in now, the displacement data is the best we've got. It's much better than the homicide data, the disappearances data, the kidnapping data, or the forced recruitment data. It's actually pretty good because, well, the High Commission for Refugees did a pretty good job, and there were a bunch of humanitarian assistance companies. Companies. That was a little bit of a slip. Sorry about that. NGOs that did really good work too. And I want to say I was leading to say good work. I did not mean to. There was nothing backhanded there. That really was a slip. They've done really terrific work and provided an enormous amount of assistance to an enormous number of people over a long period. And the Colombian state organized that data in a fairly useful way. And so when we use our models, we don't find all that much missingness in that data. We actually, I mean, there's some, you know, but it's not terrible. It's not like homicide where it's, you know, like at least a third or more missing. And so I have a little bit more confidence in that. Now that's maybe the Colombian situation is special. And we got all the data that was out there, because the Colombian state is able to compel all these other organizations to share data with them. And so that was, and I'm working for part of this quasi-state organizations, institutions, and so we were able to get that data. At an NGO level, I doubt I could get it because I wouldn't have the kind of authority that would allow someone to share that data with me. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that helps you, but it's a really this problem of how we teach people or get people to get to the notion of, well, partial data is actually kind of a bad thing. We need to deal with it. It's not just, well, it's the best we've got. We're just going to go with it. I mean, that's hard to do, and that's part of why I want to have these conversations with people before we're in the room and they need a decision in an hour. By then, you've probably lost. But if we could get them in university when they're being trained to be business leaders or political leaders or lawyers or judges or all the other people who are not statisticians or journalists, people who need to understand this up front, and we could teach them statistical appreciation from the beginning, I feel like then we could get in the room and they'd be like, oh yeah, you know what? I remember that. I learned that in university. I remember, and they could have a more thoughtful and sophisticated understanding about what is a good statistic and what is just some kind of made up thing based on a list somebody managed to put together.
Jørgen?
Yeah, thank you. Jørgen, I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO. I'm a historian, so I'm definitely working on my statistics appreciation and not trying to get to become a statistician. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what I kind of hear is a kind of negative experience from the Peru data, because the Peru data, you needed to sort of end the conflict and get the Truth Commission in order to get that data.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking particularly about the Syrian case now, where the United Nations first said, you know, we give up. We don't know how many people are dying.
Well, first they made a series of lists, and I know because I made them. So then they gave up.
Then you're in a great position to answer.
Yes.
Wonderful. Because yeah, and then they gave up, and then they kind of
Started
came
again.
in with an estimate.
No, not yet. No, they came in just with a list, and they said they were going to make an estimate, maybe in March.
Right.
Yeah, we're on it.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, us too.
My question is then, you know, what happens in sort of the interval when you're waiting for that Truth Commission that will give you that data, like the Peru situation?
Right. Look, this is immensely hard, and we talked about this a little bit at lunch. You know, the need for a timely response, and the answer is I don't know that we can. It's interesting in the Syrian case because that was probably the closest to real time we've ever gotten, and there we were just sprinting through the machine learning stuff to get all the databases duplicated. One of the things that's fascinating to me about Syria is that Syria, as soon as the conflict started, had terrific NGOs documenting deaths right away, like bang, right from the beginning. They were publishing these lists. And so we were able to, through partnerships and through their public websites, I mean, we were able to scrape their websites, which we did with permission, but nonetheless, we could get the data and start deduplicating it right away. And from that, make estimates. We've never made global estimates around Syria for some technical problems that I think we may have solved, but I'm not sure yet. I would love to discuss them. This is another little wrinkle in MSE, but nobody's asked me about machine learning or about capture heterogeneity. This is a technical audience. Come on, somebody. Anyway, back to Syria. The trick is so we've done that. We did it for the UN, and then they changed policy, and we didn't do it, and we did other things, and they came back to us and said we'd like to do it again. And it's okay, fine. And we weren't even able to say for a long time that we were doing it. In the first round, we were able to publish it together and that, but then after a while they weren't saying. But then the High Commissioner actually mentioned us in the meeting, so we were able to say it now. But this is very, very new. Like literally in the last month, we've been able to say we're doing it again. And I'm super excited. And she implied that we would make estimates in the future. We're really excited about it. If you want a hint about what those might look like, we published a study in Significance magazine years ago. I mean, a lot of years ago. It's on our website, or if you ping me, I can find the link for you. In which we did estimates for Hama and Homs and talked about some kind of weird, what we were trying to do in this paper is talk about the variation between conflict dynamics and documentation dynamics and how those don't always go in the same direction. And sometimes documentation goes down while violence goes up, and sometimes the other way around. And that has to do really with the logistical capacity of the groups to access the areas and talk to people, which is very, very hard, right? It's conflict. You know, there's bombs and shooting and like you have a notebook. I mean, you know, and the bravery of the people doing this work just gobsmacks me every time I think about it. But anyway, that's not a huge, I don't think that's a very good answer, but that's what we got. So, but send me an email if you can't find the article on our website. I'm pretty sure it was 2014 or 2015 in Significance magazine. And just to put a little PRIO note in there, Anita was really the key driver of that article. So Megan and I are the other authors, but Anita drove it.
Sure, it helped with our visit here. That's probably instrumental. Miriam.
Thank you. My name is Miriam Sørli. I did my polit thesis together with Henrik at PRIO, so I always feel like a PRIO. Now I'm with the Norwegian Refugee Company Council.
Sorry about that.
I work not in the NRC country programs, but I work in the department called NORCAP, where we historically have deployed experts to support the UN in particular, and that has always been our kind of standard formula. But now we're also trying to move into a much broader approach where we ultimately would like to kind of seek bridging the research practitioner policymaker divide. And I think yes to division of labor and yes to working together. I manage 2 portfolios in my current job where I have a project on sexual violence in conflict, where we work very closely with DPO, supporting them in terms of training and capacity building. Would really like to speak to you afterwards, Ragnhild, and I'd really like to take a look at the proposal you mentioned that's in your bag to see if we can find avenues of cooperating, because I think we do a lot of valuable work in the field. And then also I manage a UN reform portfolio, which I'm working on the UN data strategy and Guterres, our common agenda, the UN 2.0, where there's lots of focus on data collection, digitalization, and I'm trying to push machine learning. So I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about that. But the proposal in your bag, I'm really interested in.
Sure.
I've been starstruck twice before in my life, meeting Kofi Annan and President Jimmy Carter, and I have the same feeling.
I am not in that esoteric realm, but I'm delighted, and I will be delighted to share this paper. Maybe I'll just send it to Henrik, and he can send it around.
Sure.
Okay. And I want to say really clearly, it's Livia's paper. That's why it's great. Okay, and it's really good. She's an amazing scientist and a terrific colleague and scholar. So, and I'm going to do a little piece of the study, but it's really she and Millie are driving the vision here. But I'm just promoting it because I think it addresses this challenge we've had for many, many years of how do we deal with this kind of intractable bias in the disclosure moment. So maybe it's not intractable. Maybe it is tractable.
Wonderful. I've exhausted my list of questions. There's a late question we could probably still manage. If not, yeah,
I had a completely different question, or I was wondering, Patrick, if you get too good at what you're doing, do you see a future where more data will be deliberately distorted so that you won't come back with be able to analyze this? There's a feedback loop here, right, where there is certain data is being collected, certain data is being analyzed. All of a sudden, these repressive regimes around the world realize that, hey, Patrick Bowles got these methods for figuring us out. We need to do things in a more sophisticated way to hide what we're up to. Do you see Can you become part of the problem?
Can I just a side note? One of my favorite stories is UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Database. On their Twitter account, the official account of FARC started to follow the UCDP data. And so that's in sort of an endogeneity problem that you haven't really, planned for or really considered. But yeah.
So we don't really use official data. Pretty much almost, very often. It's not never. And when we can get access to it, it can be quite interesting. But the official data we use is always administrative data. It's never data that's collected for this purpose. It's always data that's collected by the prosecutor's office for example, to manage their caseload, or it's collected by the police because they have to record homicides that are denounced to them, or it's the cadavers that are recorded by the Forensic Medicine Institute. And so, we have a list of those, but those are collected for their own purposes. And our access to it later is after the data is in some sense stale and cold, in the sense that it's no longer kind of interesting to someone to interfere with. The more live data, the more kind of hot data generally comes from NGOs. And they are putting their entire institutional reputations on getting this stuff right. Now, to some extent, we all will have a story about at least one NGO somewhere who's maybe made something up or exaggerated something in some way. It's really hard to exaggerate a list of deaths. It's actually really, really hard. And I know because I've spent a lot of time trying to create fake data for students or for examples, and it's actually really challenging because you end up with names that are repeated, you end up with all kinds of kind of weird and fairly obvious artifacts in the structure of data. You can make up 10 or 100 names. Good luck making up 10,000. And then distributing them in some geographically and temporally plausible way that makes any sense at all when someone does a little bit of descriptives just trying to understand the data set. So this is actually a hard problem. Now I'm going to intersect this data set with others. And if you've made up 10,000 names, there's not going to be any intersection. And that's just going to bright red light jump off the thing where you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Where did you get 10,000 deaths nobody else has seen even one of before? You can sprinkle it, you could salt it, you could try to be a bit more sophisticated. It's going to be pretty obvious because a group that if you add enough made up fake data to distort the results, then it's going to look really weird when I show that upset plot. Somebody's going to be a big peak where they have all this data that nobody else has. Now, it might make sense that they have that happens, and that's why I put this one up, where the police have a bunch of data that no one else has. Well, that kind of makes sense because they're saying that they killed these people, and they may be the only people who actually acknowledge that death. But it's going to be weird in some cases. And I have an example which we flagged early on. This has got to be 2013. So the first of the lists I did for the UN. In the Syria project, Megan and I did this first in 2012 and then in 2013 at the very beginning of the conflict. And we published a list in 2013, and the second time we did it, the High Commissioner of Human Rights reached out to the Syrian government and said, "Okay, tell us about your people who've been killed, and other people, the deaths you're tracking. Surely you're tracking deaths in the conflict." And the Syrian government was like, "Of course." And they had denounced us earlier for not using data from them. We're like, "Okay, fine, give us the data." And they gave us the data and it didn't intersect with anybody. Mm-hmm. And we're like, "Okay, either you're covering a population that is nobody else is touching at all," which is maybe, but do we really think that none of the civil society groups would report policemen's murders? Or you just made this up. Or you didn't really make up the names and the deaths. What you did is you found people who had died in other contexts, generally prior to the conflict, and then you changed all the dates to move them forward so that it looked like they'd been killed in the conflict, which is what we ultimately concluded once we investigated a bunch of these cases. And people were like, "Well, hang on, we know that death. That happened in 2009. Mm-hmm. And we started finding them going back. And so it looked like they had come up with a list of officials who had died in different contexts and then counted them as conflict deaths and moved the dates up during the conflict so that it would look like they had been killed by the insurgents. And so we're like, yeah, no, we can't use that. Mm. So, this is one of the cool things about record linkage is, well, it's cool, but it's also a little creepy, which is that it's really hard to make up data that's going to go through record linkage. Because if it's going to be matched against real data, fake data is going to just be a super obvious, jump off the page weirdness. Mm. And that's true in graphical representations, but even more so when you're getting into the models and you start seeing that the model starts picking up kind of weird things that one of the covariates in the model is going to be the which group contributed each record. And if you end up getting a really big negative coefficient on that thing, you're like, what? why do you have a negative coefficient? This group is just jumping off the rest of the pattern. So, and they're not actually coefficients because it's, it's boosted gradient descent, so we don't actually have coefficients. It's not regression, but nonetheless, the logic is not all that similar. We do variable importance. No one asks me any of those.
No, thank you so much, Patrick, because you're opening up, a huge set of other interesting questions, and I know we could have gone on forever. I think you could have kept this audience warm for the whole night, and we're very appreciative of the work that the HRDAG is doing, and the work that you're doing, both as a scientific sort of leading star, but also as an actual human rights activist and using these scientific methods to keep leaders and governments accountable. And then thanks to the panel for a great discussion. Thanks to everyone for coming up, and thanks to the Rafto Foundation again for really giving a prize that I think will matter and really resonate in the academic community as well as in policy. So thanks for bringing Patrick here. Thanks for coming, Patrick, and safe travels back home. Make sure that you're continuing to make these efforts that in the end will have some real important implications. Thank you.
Thank you.